Is this on? I think this is on. Is it on? Okay, this is on. Fair enough. Okay, so I don't have a high recording studio because I'm poor as shit, but that's okay. Lyndon Johnson became president on the 22nd of November 1963. That's because John F. Kennedy had a few things going on which made him not become president anymore, because his head was blown off by a guy who shot him because CIA and shit, I don't really know. Basically, Johnson kind of carried on the same things Kennedy did, but you can't doubt he did have a huge impact on what the US was and what it would become in the latter stages of the century. So, in this new idea that Johnson came up with was called the Great Society. Now, the Great Society is something which funds people. It's a welfare system. It's a new form of America, really. It puts a lot more emphasis on federal interruption and interventionism, but there's a lot of critics of that, particularly Richard Nixon, who would later become the president after Johnson, of course. Now, simply to put it, the Great Society would be characterised by the end of poverty, racial inequality, which we've seen beforehand, characters like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, of course, Stokely Carmichael, Thurgood Marshall, lots of chaps who did their bits. Educational reform, modern housing, the end of urban decay, a renewed sense of community, environmentalism, peace with other nations, which is not really important, but you've got to put it in there to understand that some reforms may not have passed because of certain acts that have gone abroad. Okay, so the Civil Rights Bill had just come through in 1964, and that meant that segregation in the South, or de jure segregation, would be put to an end in pretty much all services. So this had been hugely due to the fact of Martin Luther King's impact in Selma, where he got quite a few voters. Let me just see the number here. It doesn't say, I don't put how many, but basically it didn't work brilliantly, but it did gain so much attention, which later influenced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Because of the violence that was explicit. I'm really retarded, I'm sorry. Oh gosh. So basically there's a lot of violence. In fact, this is what it said. I'm not 100% sure on this. I might just double check, because I was quite astounded when I found out. Okay, well, when you type in snakes thrown at Selma, you get a bunch of videos about Salma Hayek and that weird Quentin Tarantino scene. And I don't really want that on my internet search history, so well, the incident became known as Bloody Sunday, not to be confused with that fake thing that happened in that country. That's full of dickheads. I'm going to upload that. So this can't be true. Well, they let loose deadly snakes on marches, basically. Not 100% sure if that's true or if it's an urban myth, but I'm not going to find out, because I've just got a bunch of pictures of snakes eating each other on my laptop and Martin Luther King, but like not. Right. Firstly, the open housing law. Now this would... Johnson didn't want after all seeing these ghettos just start building up, and squalor and poverty and poor education, he wanted a new housing law so blacks would not be imprisoned to these disgusting areas. Now integrated housing was pretty not very liked, especially if you think of the suburbs and how it was probably in a town of 100,000, 50 could be black. Even then, whites would discriminate against the community for having blacks in their neighbourhood. It was really, that's how serious it really was. But this, of course, was the 50s and attitudes were changed. Now, Johnson would receive hate mail over the fact that he wanted to integrate black and white housing. But what happened in this time, 1968, something big happened in the civil rights movement, and that was the death of Martin Luther King Jr. at the hands of James Earl Ray, just this crazy white supremacist who died in not very long ago, actually 20 years ago, in a prison. But obviously the death of Martin Luther King was so tragic and so for a character so loved throughout the nation, they decided to put some sort of legislative tribute towards him, and that was the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which prevented discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. But the problem with some of these laws, and most of these laws, is that it's very hard to track who actually follows them. So a white landlord may not rent to a black family just because, and may not be checked on it, and it's really, that's what it's down to sometimes. In terms of civil rights, Johnson was the president during the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. You could attribute this to the activists themselves, like Luther King and Malcolm X, but Johnson did care deeply about this because he used executive powers to help black Americans, especially as an executive order of 1965, which required any institution receiving federal funding to employ more non-whites, which is kind of affirmative action, essentially, which still continues today in some areas where they would, I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe, but it's like when you don't discriminate. Affirmative action is when you don't really, it's not really discrimination, it integrates more blacks into a workplace or a housing estate, essentially, but it's not really, it sounds racist, but it's more to do with looking better. Google did it a while ago because, you know, LA. California is just, that's what it is. With all, yeah, but it was very loved by liberals, obviously, because of it would help minorities in terms of employment, education, while conservatives criticised its discriminating against blacks and demeaning blacks. Discriminating against whites, there you go. Although the situation of many black Americans remained dire, Johnson had helped improve their social, political and economic status through the civil rights legislation. Now, that is pretty key in learning about what Lyndon Baines Johnson, who died in 1974, I think, was portrayed by Woody Harrelson in the film LBJ. No, it was 73, my apologies. He was a very... one thing important about Johnson is that firstly he was very stubborn, secondly he did not get on well with people. He was a bit like a Marmite character, really. So, an example of this was he saw Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General during JFK's time, as a bit of an idiot. Just back way up on that. Yeah, they would bicker with each other. They were this is history.com, so it's probably wrong, but Oh, great, yeah, I totally want to know about the story of the Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her mother. Fuck off, you fat fucking cunt. Right. No. You know, yeah, as it states here, that's pretty right. Bobby Kennedy disliked Johnson. Just shows you how disillusioned. Obviously, the Democrats themselves were split between the Southern Democrats, like Joe McCarthy. I think no, fuck, that's wrong. Hold on a sec. Joe McCarthy's right. John C. Calhoun. Oh wait, this is the 1800s. No, we don't. I forgot their names now, if I'm honest. Okay, fuck that. Well, yeah, that's basically it for civil rights. You know, Johnson, he did do quite a lot. Very important, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the way that it really did essentially, it ended de jure racism. It made it unlawful to be racist, which was a big stepping stone. Obviously, still today, racism is everywhere. Will it end? Probably not. It won't end until everyone's cream coloured, or whatever. When everyone looks like M. Night Shyamalan, that is when it will end. But no, yeah, it was still huge, huge.